More silence filled the room. What? You speak fish now? I joked back at him. It wasn't really the time for joking around, but I was up for a little levity. No, asshole. It said something. I heard it. Dave doubled down. I've listened to these things for over a decade, and nothing has ever sounded like that. He looked at me straight-faced. So, you're saying you do speak fish? I responded as I sat back down, leaning on my desk and raising an eyebrow. This got Dave visibly angry, something I wasn't ready for. No, you dick. But I speak a language, and that sounded like a language. He shot back at me. He spun around in his chair to face the screen again. He fiddled around with the screen for a handful of moments before spinning back around and taking his headphones off. He held them towards me. Here. Listen. I shrugged and I reached for the headset. What the fuck, Mike? Get back on the drone. Janet pointed at my screen as she re-entered the room. I felt like I got caught with my pants down. Right. Sorry. I nearly yelled back. Now definitely wasn't the time to pitch the magical talking whale to the captain. I guess Dave caught a similar vibe and kept quiet. I still haven't seen anything unusual. Wait. I cut myself short as I noticed something I should have before. Their drone isn't docked. Could that be important? I asked. The captain retook her position behind me, arms crossed and shrouded in her quiet intensity. The fact that she was thinking was loud somehow. The weight of her choices seemed to weigh down the room. Bring the drone back, halfway, she said sternly as she turned and walked off. Why halfway? What does that accomplish? Dave asked, thinking he was out of the loop. He wasn't. I had no idea either. Because I'm going to meet it halfway. Janet responded sharply. She opened her locker at the back of the room and took her scuba gear out. You can't fucking do that. What? Dave and I both reacted. That was an outrageously dangerous idea. Diving alone is dangerous. At night, 10 times worse. In the middle of the ocean, surrounded by unknown circumstances, seemed like a suicide mission. Janet pursed her lips at us and glared as she wriggled an arm into her wetsuit. With the VLF down, I have to make the calls. I can't go over there and figure it out. She slid the harness, holding her O2 tank over her shoulders. I've got thousands of more diving hours than the rest of you. I'm the strongest swimmer. I'll be fine. Bring the drone back, halfway. When you meet me, turn it around and head back to Hab 2. I'll go with it. Dave and I sat in our chairs, silently. She was in command, and even though what she was saying was against safety procedures, we weren't really in the realm of procedure anymore. I turned back to my screen and started the drone back. You'll be able to hear me on the main console. It's got a transceiver. Dave and I continued our silent protest. Dave got up and walked to the main console as Janet sealed the pressure hatch behind her and entered the nighttime ocean. Janet was too quiet for me to hear her across the room on the main console. I could see the lights on her suit as the drone made its way back. They were drowned out by our Hab's floodlights. There wasn't a doubt in my mind she was heroically forging forward, though. I cringed at the thought. This was a stupid fucking idea. Dave was talking to Janet through the main console. I could only hear his side of the conversation, though. As I made my way back towards the center of the gorge, I noticed the nose of the drone waiting to dip down again. I was about to give it some thought, but Dave interrupted me. She says to keep it as level as possible. She doesn't want to end up down in the gorge, he said. I could tell he was really as annoyed by the plan as I was. Yeah, tell her I got it. I shook my head and chewed the inside of my mouth. Eventually, as I made my way back across the gorge. I could make out a smaller, dimmer light distinctly from the floodlights. There she was. I didn't know if it was exactly halfway, but we were about to meet. I held forward on the controls, fully intent on meeting her physically, when the nose of the drone began to significantly drop. I fought it for a moment, but I only went a short distance further, and the drone couldn't even stay level anymore. I floored the drone backwards, and it stabilized again. "Tell her to stop! Stop where she is!" I shouted across the room. "What?" Dave answered, startled. He fumbled with the transceiver for a second, but almost immediately shouted at Janet to stop. But it was too late. I watched as the lights from Janet's suit struggled to stay up a moment before being violently dragged down and spun like a pinwheel into the abyss. I couldn't hear Janet before, but I could hear her through the transceiver now. I heard her scream. I heard her scream as I pointed the drone's camera down to watch her lights speed down in the darkness, spinning as she went. She took another breath and screamed again as her headlamp disappeared into the darkness of the gorge. I couldn't see her, but I could still hear her as I stared at the screen. "Janet? What's happening?" Dave yelled into his end of the comms. He couldn't see what happened. Her lights would have been too dim to see from the main window. "Janet! Hello?" He was nearly screaming now. He looked over to me. "What happened?" he shouted. I looked at him with my mouth hanging agape. Amy shot into the room. "What happened? What's the matter?" She yelled at both of us. Dave and I both looked at Amy, then back at one another. I started slowly. Cap went out into the water. Amy already had something to say about that, but I ignored her and continued. I leaned forward in my chair and put my head in my hands as I explained. She was going to meet the drone halfway over to Hab 2, but around the center of the gorge. I trailed off as Dave screamed into the transceiver for Janet again. I felt an undercurrent on the drone, and it got really strong. I tried to get Dave to stop her, but she got too close and... I stopped again, afraid to even say it. She got sucked down. I looked up at Amy on the last word. She was horrified, and she was speechless. Amy walked over to the main window. "She's down there?" she asked, looking over the edge of the gorge that was lit by our floodlights. She's dead," Dave mumbled. His voice was an uneven mix of sorrow and disbelief. "The gorge is at least thousands of meters deep." He swallowed hard. "In scuba gear, there's no way she could have survived the pressure." We were all well aware, but none of us could believe it. Maybe the down current didn't go all the way down? Amy threatened us with hope. I shook my head. She went down really fast. "She screamed for a long time before she cut out," Dave added. I glanced at the main window. Amy and Dave did the same. Janet was the captain, the boss, but she was still a good friend to all of us. Dave sat at the main console with his face in his hands. Amy stood there at the door frame, defeated. "I've felt it too. The undercurrent," I said quietly. I could have stopped her. I felt like my chair would collapse under the weight of my mistake. "You can't think like that, Mike. You told Dave to stop her as soon as you felt it." Amy spoke weakly. I only now noticed she was quietly sobbing. "No, I felt it earlier, on the first trip over," I admitted. Dave turned in his chair a bit, and then turned his head to face me. "What?" he asked, devoid of emotion, or maybe straining against the force of every emotion. I felt it halfway over, just a few minutes ago. It wasn't as strong, so I just thought the drone was still messed up, and I tried to explain. And you didn't think to mention it? Dave exploded at me verbally as well as physically. He launched out of his chair towards me, knocking over a table on his way. I put up my hands to defend myself, but in the struggle, my chair ended up flipped over, with me on top of it, and Dave on top of me. His eyes were wide and wild as I looked up at him, and he cocked a fist above us both. I'm not a fighter, but thankfully neither was Dave. I flung my hands towards the oncoming punch and redirected it somewhere. Dave reached to pin one of my hands and got a hold of one of them. He readied another punch. I closed my eyes, but Dave was suddenly on the ground next to me. Amy stood over both of us. She had been yelling during the scuffle about what I didn't know, until I heard her say the lights were back on. I sat up and looked out at the main window. The other hab's floodlights were on. I stood up instantly, and Dave joined me. They were back on, but something else was wrong now. When they went off, they were in their default, unextended position. Now they were splayed out all over the place, up and down, left and right, all seemingly extended as far as they could go. How does that even fucking happen? Dave asked. It was pitch black over there, I said. They wouldn't be able to extend those arms without power. Amy finished our thoughts for us. We stood there, a crack team of expert scientists, answerless. My thoughts went back to the drone. I could pilot it over and see. I had almost gotten turned around before I noticed something. The furthest left light on Hab 2 went out, but it didn't go out. It was like something had moved in front of it. I looked at it for a moment, and then the next most left light went out, and then the next, and then the next. The lights were up and down, all over the place, so whatever was obscuring them was enormous. It overtook the dimmer lights of our drone, and then the next light on Hab 2. My mind thought that eventually the leftmost light would have to become unobscured, but it didn't. Light after light was devoured before the final rightmost light disappeared as well. Whatever we were looking at was absolutely colossal, but it was beyond the reach of our fully extended floodlights. We could only see the absence it caused with its presence. Suddenly, all the lights were back. Whatever we were watching slowly moved, darted down into the gorge, bringing all of the lights back into view at once. In all of the stunned silences I had experienced in the last hour or so, this was the most stunning. Dave broke the spellbind. He ran over to the sonar console to our left. I watched him run over and simply stand there in front of it. After a moment, he stood to the side so we could see the screen. They were definitely the strongest waveforms I've ever seen on that screen. Giant peaks. Dave looked at us wide-eyed. It's been speaking this whole time.